Everyone treats Family Guy like harmless background noise. A cartoon you laugh at and forget by morning. Just jokes, people say. Just cutaways. Nothing more. Federal judges disagreed. So did a sitting governor's own daughter, a grieving brother, and the network that made it. In this video, we break down how Family Guy kept getting more and more offensive every season. The early warning signs. 1999. Family Guy did not slide into trouble slowly. It walked into trouble on its very first night. The show came from Seth MacFarlane, a young animator who pitched Fox on the idea of a working-class family living in the made-up town of Quahog, Rhode Island. The family at the center of the show was Peter Griffin, a loud and not very bright father, his wife Lois, their three kids Chris, Meg, and baby Stewie, and their talking dog Brian. Fox put the first episode on the air on January 31st, 1999, right after the Super Bowl, which is one of the biggest television slots a network can hand a new show. That slot alone tells you Fox believed in it. Networks do not hand their newest, least proven programs the single most watched night of the entire television calendar by accident. They hand that slot to shows they think can grab a massive audience that is already sitting on the couch, already paying attention, and already primed to keep watching whatever comes on next once the game ends. Fox took that gamble on a brand new animated show about a loud father, his family, and a talking dog. And that decision alone says something about how much confidence the network had in the concept before a single episode had even aired for the general public. What happened next is that critics and watchdog groups started reacting almost immediately, and some of that reaction never really stopped for the next 2.5 decades. To understand why people got upset so fast, it helps to know what kind of show Family Guy was trying to be from day one. It was not trying to be a warm family sitcom with a lesson at the end of each episode, the kind of show where a family argument gets resolved with a hug before the credits roll. It was built around quick jokes that jumped away from the main story, often called cutaway gags, where the show would leave the plot for a few seconds to show something completely unrelated and often shocking, then snap back to where it left off, as if nothing had happened. This style let the writers touch almost any subject they wanted without needing to build a full story around it. A joke about a celebrity, a historical event, a religion, or a sensitive topic could show up for 5 seconds and then vanish, gone before anyone watching had time to fully sit with what they had just seen. That structure is part of why the show could move so fast from one controversial idea to another, and it is also part of why critics zeroed in on it right away. A traditional sitcom has to build toward its jokes across an entire scene, giving the audience time to understand the setup before the punchline lands. Family Guy did not need to do any of that. It could simply cut away, deliver the entire joke in a handful of seconds, and cut right back, meaning the writers were never forced to slow down and explain themselves or justify where a joke had come from. This gave the show an enormous amount of creative freedom, but it also meant that when a joke landed badly, there was no built-in moment for the show to soften it, contextualize it, or walk it back before moving on to the next scene. The first wave of criticism came from television critics who cover new shows every season, professionals whose entire job is to watch new programs closely and tell the public what to expect from them. Ken Tucker, who wrote for Entertainment Weekly, reviewed Family Guy in April of 1999, just a couple months after it started airing regularly. He was not impressed. He gave the show a low grade, a D, and made it clear he thought the writing leaned on shock instead of actual jokes, meaning he believed the show was trying to get a reaction out of viewers through simple surprise and discomfort, rather than through genuinely clever or well-constructed comedy. This distinction mattered to Tucker, because there is a real difference between a joke that makes someone laugh because it is smart or unexpected in a satisfying way, and a joke that makes someone react simply because it says something shocking or crude out loud. Tucker's early review argued the show was leaning heavily on the second kind of reaction, rather than the first. This was not a one-time complaint that Tucker made once and then dropped. He kept an eye on the show through the rest of the year, and his opinion did not soften as the months went on. A critic changing his mind about a new show after watching more episodes is common. A critic doubling down on his original harsh judgment, episode after episode, is a stronger signal that the problems he identified early on were not a fluke tied to one bad episode, but a real and consistent pattern running through the show's writing. At the same time, a different kind of critic was watching, one that operated completely differently from a magazine columnist reviewing a new show for entertainment readers. The Parents Television Council, a group that watches over what appears on American television and pushes back against content it sees as harmful, started paying close attention to Family Guy from its earliest episodes. This group did not exist to give star ratings or grades the way Entertainment Weekly did. It existed specifically to track programming it believed could be harmful, especially to children, and to organize public pressure and formal complaints against that programming. This group would go on to watch the show for its entire run, filing complaints and publishing lists for over 20 years. But the important thing to know for this section is that their attention did not start later, after the show had already built a reputation for controversy that made it an obvious target. It started right at the beginning, while Family Guy was still a brand new series trying to find its footing, still introducing its characters to an audience that had never seen them before, still working out exactly what kind of show it was going to be from week to week. A brand new show usually gets some benefit of the doubt from critics and watchdog groups alike, a kind of grace period where people wait to see how the show settles in before passing final judgment. Family Guy did not get that grace period from either Ken Tucker or the Parents Television Council. Both were paying close, critical attention from nearly the very first episodes. By the fall of 1999, less than a year into the show, two separate controversies landed close together, and together they gave the first real signal that Family Guy was not going to play it safe, not going to quietly adjust its content to avoid trouble, and not going to slow down simply because some critics and watchdog groups were already unhappy with what they were seeing. The first came from a media watchdog named L. Brent Bozell III, who wrote a column in October of 1999 focused on an episode called Holy Crap. Bozell argued that the episode promoted anti-Catholic ideas, meaning ideas hostile or disrespectful toward the Catholic Church and its followers, and he was blunt about his frustration with the show for going after religion in a way he saw as disrespectful rather than merely playful. This was one of the earliest moments where a national commentator singled out a specific Family Guy episode by name and used it as a clear example of the show crossing a line, rather than simply complaining about the show's general tone or attitude. Naming a specific episode and building an entire published argument around it is a much more serious and pointed kind of criticism than a general complaint about a show being crude or edgy. It shows the commentator watched the actual episode closely enough to build a specific case against its specific content, rather than reacting only to secondhand descriptions or a general reputation. It would not be the last time religion became a flashpoint for the show across its long history, but this was the episode that opened that particular door, setting a precedent that religion, much like race and serious illness, was going to be treated as fair game for the show's comedy from its very earliest days, whether critics and religious commentators liked it or not. Around the same time, something else happened that had a bigger practical impact than any single published column could ever have on its own. After the Holy Crap episode aired, Fox pulled Family Guy from its schedule entirely. The show vanished from the lineup, and while the stated reason given at the time was low ratings, the timing lined up closely enough with the backlash over the episode that many people connected the two events directly, wondering whether the controversy itself had played some role in the network's decision, even if low ratings were the official explanation given publicly. The show did not disappear forever, though. It came back for one single night in December of that year to air an episode called Da Boom, appearing just once, almost like a brief test to see how audiences and advertisers would react, before going quiet again for a few more months. It then returned again in March to finish out its second season properly, settling back into a regular schedule after this strange, uneven stretch of appearing, disappearing, and reappearing again. That stop and start pattern, on the air, off the air, back on for a single night, off again, and then finally back on for good, is not something that happens to a show networks feel totally confident about. It is the kind of scheduling you see when executives are nervous about a program's reputation and its relationship with advertisers, while still not wanting to give up on the show completely, testing the waters carefully, rather than either fully committing to a normal schedule or canceling the show outright. By the time Entertainment Weekly published its year-end roundup of the worst television of 1999, Ken Tucker did not hold back at all. He named Family Guy the single worst show of the entire year, a distinction that stands out sharply considering how many new shows premiere across any given television season, and how many of those shows fail in far less interesting or memorable ways than simply being poorly reviewed. Being named the single worst show of an entire year out of every show that aired that year across every network is a very specific and very public kind of judgment. The specific language Tucker used in that piece is important because it lays out in plain terms exactly what critics were objecting to from the very start of the show's existence. He pointed to jokes he considered racist, jokes he considered anti-Semitic, and jokes built around AIDS. And he paired that criticism with complaints about the show's cheap-looking animation and ideas he felt were borrowed from other cartoons rather than genuinely original. This was not a vague complaint about the show being crude in some general, hard-to-pin-down sense. It was a specific list of the exact categories of humor that would keep showing up in controversy stories about Family Guy for years and years afterward. Almost like Tucker had accidentally written a preview of the show's entire future reputation within his very first full year of covering it. Race, religion, and serious illness were already, in year one, the three areas where the show was making people the most uncomfortable, years before any of the show's more famous later controversies involving real political families or real deceased public figures had even happened.
It is worth sitting with how early all this actually happened, because the speed of it is easy to underestimate when looking back from decades later. Family Guy premiered in January of 1999. By April, a major television critic writing for one of the most widely read entertainment magazines in the country had already given it a failing grade. By October, a national commentator was accusing it of religious bigotry in a published column, and the network had pulled it off the air entirely, at least for a stretch of months. By December, that same critic named it the worst show on television for the entire year, using words like racist and anti-Semitic to describe its content in a mainstream, widely read publication. All of that took less than 12 months from the show's very first broadcast. The show had not yet finished its second season. It had not yet introduced most of the storylines fans would eventually associate with its later, more famous years. It had not yet built the massive cast of recurring characters, running jokes, and specific comedic voices that longtime fans think of when they picture the show today. And yet it had already built a small but loud group of critics who believed it had a real, documented problem with how it handled sensitive subjects, a belief they were willing to put into print under their own names in publications with national circulation. The Parents Television Council kept building on this early reputation rather than letting it fade. In May of 2000, the group launched a public campaign aimed directly at Fox, asking the network to cancel Family Guy entirely, not simply to tone down specific jokes or adjust specific episodes, but to end the show outright. This came right after the show had returned from a long break in its second season, a break the council said was caused by weak support from advertisers and low ratings, echoing the same kind of practical, business-focused reasoning that had already shaped the network's earlier decision to pull the show off the air the previous fall. The council did not treat this campaign as a minor issue, tucked away in a small newsletter somewhere. Getting a network to fully cancel a show, rather than just complain about individual episodes here and there, was a much bigger and more ambitious ask. And the fact that the council was already willing to make that ask shows how seriously some groups were taking the show's content just 1 year into its existence, long before the show had become the long-running cultural fixture it would eventually turn into. Later that same year, Family Guy landed on the council's list of the worst primetime shows for family viewing, one of the very first times the show appeared on that kind of list at all. It would go on to appear on similar lists again in 2005 and in 2006, and would eventually be named the single worst show of an entire television season by that same organization years later. But 2000 marked the very start of that pattern, not some middle chapter in an already established story. The show's association with these kinds of lists began almost as early as the show itself did. What makes this first year so useful for understanding the rest of the show's history is that it set the template for almost everything that followed across the next 2 decades. The show leaned into jokes about groups and topics that made people uneasy, choosing subjects like race, religion, and serious illness right from its earliest episodes, rather than working its way up to them gradually over several seasons. Critics responded fast, and specifically naming exact categories of humor rather than complaining only in vague, general terms about tone or taste. A watchdog group formed a lasting habit of monitoring the show closely, a habit that would continue essentially unbroken for the entire run of the series. And the network, while clearly nervous at times, judging by its willingness to pull episodes and rearrange schedules, never fully backed away from the show either. Fox pulled episodes, moved schedules around, and let the show go quiet for stretches when the pressure seemed highest, but it always brought Family Guy back eventually, never treating any single controversy as serious enough to end the show for good. That pattern of temporary retreat followed by return would repeat itself many more times across the decades that followed, just with bigger episodes, bigger names attached to the criticism, and louder public reactions attached to each new controversy as the show grew more famous and more widely watched. It also matters a great deal that none of this early criticism came from people who misunderstood what kind of show they were actually watching, or who were reacting with simple shock at unfamiliar content without any real expertise behind their opinions. Ken Tucker was a professional television critic who reviewed shows for a living, someone whose entire career depended on
accurately understanding and evaluating what he watched. L. Brent Bozell III ran an organization built specifically around monitoring media content for exactly this kind of material, meaning he approached the show already equipped with a clear framework for identifying what he considered objectionable. The Parents Television Council existed for the sole purpose of tracking programming like this, employing people whose full-time work involved watching television critically and comparing what they saw against a defined set of standards. These were not casual viewers stumbling onto an unfamiliar cartoon late at night and reacting with simple, uninformed shock. These were people whose job, in one way or another, was to watch closely and respond with specific, documented complaints built on real expertise and close attention. And even they were taken aback by how far the show went in its very first year on the air, before it had even built the reputation that might have prepared later viewers for exactly what kind of content to expect. There is one more detail from this early period that deserves attention, because it shows how quickly the show's reputation solidified into something almost expected, rather than something that came as a fresh surprise each time. When Ken Tucker wrote his year-end piece calling Family Guy the worst show of 1999, he was not writing about a brand new problem he had just discovered in December, out of nowhere. By that point in the year, this was already a show he had reviewed poorly back in April, a show that had already drawn religious controversy in October through Bozell's column, and a show that had already been pulled from the air once, however briefly, that same fall. His final verdict for the year was less of a fresh discovery made all at once, and more of a summary of a full year's worth of accumulated warning signs, each one building on the last. That is a useful thing to notice, because it means the show's reputation for controversial content was not built by one single explosive episode landing all at once and generating a single wave of backlash. It was built brick by brick, complaint by complaint, critique by critique over the entire course of its very first year on the air, long before most casual viewers had even heard of Stewie, Quagmire, or any of the other characters who would later become the show's most famous and most talked about troublemakers in the years and seasons still to come. By the end of that first full year, Family Guy had already collected the basic ingredients that would go on to define its entire run for the next 2.5 decades. It had a network willing to keep giving it chances despite the noise surrounding it, pulling episodes and rearranging schedules rather than canceling it outright. It had critics on record, in print, under their own names, calling out specific categories of offensive humor rather than vague general complaints. It had a watchdog group that had already asked for its cancellation once and would keep watching closely for the next 2 decades without ever fully losing interest in the show. And it had already been pulled from the air at least once because of backlash tied directly to a specific episode's content, establishing a precedent for exactly that kind of response well before the show had built any kind of long-term reputation to protect. None of the show's most famous later controversies, the ones involving real political figures, real tragedies, and real advocacy groups years down the line, had happened yet. Those were still ahead. Waiting in later seasons, the show had not even reached yet. But the foundation for how the show would handle controversy, and how the public, critics, and watchdog groups would respond to that controversy, was already fully in place before the show had even finished airing its second season, set down in less time than it takes many shows just to find their voice. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What happened next did not slow down. It sped up, and it eventually reached a single stretch of time where the show produced not one, but several of its most talked about controversies within the space of roughly a year, involving a sitting political family, a woman in a decade-long medical battle that had already divided the entire country, and a storyline the network refused to let air at all. Section 2. The cutaway gag that started the playbook. Every long-running show eventually settles into a method, a repeated pattern it leans on again and again because it works. For Family Guy, that method showed up early and never really left. The show found a comedy tool that let it dodge almost every rule of normal storytelling, and once it found that tool, it used it constantly. That tool is the cutaway gag, and understanding how it works is the key to understanding almost every controversy the show has ever caused, including one of its earliest and ugliest, a scene built around a man dying of AIDS. A cutaway gag is a short break from the main story. The show is following Peter or Lois or one of the kids through some ordinary situation, and then, without warning, the picture jumps somewhere else entirely. Maybe it is a flashback. Maybe it is something happening on the other side of town that has nothing to do with the plot. Maybe it is a reference to a movie, a song, or a real event. The gag plays out for a few seconds, sometimes less than 10, and then the show snaps right back
to where it left off, as if nothing happened. Nobody in the main story ever mentions the cutaway again. It exists purely for the joke, disconnected from everything around it. This structure gave the writers something most comedy shows do not have, which is almost total freedom. A joke about a serious topic does not need to fit into the plot. It does not need a reason to exist beyond being funny to whoever wrote it. It can touch a subject for 5 seconds and vanish before anyone watching has time to fully process what they just saw. That speed is part of the appeal for fans who like the show's rapid-fire style, but it is also exactly why so many of the show's biggest controversies involve cutaway gags specifically. A joke that lasts 5 seconds and disappears is much easier to defend as harmless fun. It is also much easier for that same joke to land badly, because there is no time built in for setup, context, or any kind of explanation. One of the clearest early examples of this pattern causing real-world backlash happened in an episode called The Cleveland Loretta Quagmire. The episode's main plot followed one of Peter's neighbors, a character dealing with a difficult situation involving his marriage. Inside that episode, the show included a cutaway gag showing Peter and a group of men, arranged like an old-fashioned singing group called a barbershop quartet, gathered around the bed of a man in the final stage of AIDS. In the scene, Peter and the group sing and dance around this dying man's bed. The joke, if it can be called that, was built entirely around treating a man's death from AIDS as a punchline, turning a serious illness that had devastated real families and communities into background material for a musical number. The reaction was immediate, and it came from a specific place. This was not simply television critics complaining about taste. Organizations that worked directly with people affected by AIDS spoke out against the scene. These were groups whose daily work involved supporting people going through exactly what the cutaway gag was mocking. People managing a disease that, especially in the years before better treatments became widely available, meant watching friends and loved ones decline and die. A magazine that focused on LGBTQ issues covered the backlash directly, noting that organizations providing AIDS services were, in their own words, not amused. That phrase, simple as it sounds, captures something important. This was not outrage for the sake of outrage. It was frustration from people who spent their careers trying to bring dignity and support to a health crisis, watching a popular television show turn the worst moment of that crisis into a dance number. A writer studying the broader trend of harsh comedy on television at the time placed Family Guy alongside a small group of other sitcoms he described as aimed at the darker side of family life. His point was not that dark humor itself is automatically wrong. His point was that Family Guy had built an entire identity around finding the darkest possible angle on ordinary situations and turning it into a laugh, over and over, episode after episode, without much concern for who might be sitting on the other end of that joke. This single cutaway gag became one of the clearest early examples of a pattern that would define the show for its entire run. Take a real and painful human experience, strip away all context, turn it into a fast, disconnected joke. Move on before anyone has time to object within the show itself. The audience at home does not get that same luxury of moving on quickly, and for people connected to AIDS service organizations, this particular joke stuck around in their minds long after the episode ended. While individual scenes like this one drew attention from specific advocacy groups, a much bigger and more organized force was watching the show as a whole. And that force is where the second half of this section needs to go, because it explains why Family Guy's reputation for offensive content became something tracked, measured, and documented for over 20 straight years. The Parents Television Council is a group built around one core purpose: watching television content and pushing back against what its members see as harmful or inappropriate, especially anything that might reach children. This group did not treat Family Guy as just one show among many to keep an eye on. It treated Family Guy as one of its primary and most consistent targets, and the numbers behind that focus are large enough to matter. Over the show's run, the council placed more than 40 separate Family Guy episodes on its list of worst TV show of the week. That is not a single bad episode getting flagged once. That is a running, repeated pattern stretching across years, with the council returning to the show again and again, episode after episode, treating it almost like a beat they covered on a regular schedule, rather than an occasional surprise. This constant attention showed up in the council's yearly rankings, too. Family Guy made the group's list of worst primetime shows for family viewing in the year 2000, again in 2005, and again in 2006. Then, for the 2006 to 2007 television season specifically, the council went a step further and named Family Guy the single worst show of that entire season, not just one bad week within it. Being called the worst show of the week is a recurring criticism. Being called the worst show of an entire season is a much bigger statement, and it shows that by the middle of the 2000s, Family Guy had built a reputation with this organization that had grown from occasional concern into something closer to a settled, official ranking. The council did not stop at criticizing the animated show itself. In 2009, Fox aired a live-action special hosted by Seth MacFarlane, along with fellow cast member Alex Borstein, called Family Guy Presents Seth and Alex's Almost Live Comedy Show. The council named this special its worst TV show of the week as well, and the specific complaints it listed are worth naming plainly because they show how wide the range of objections had become by that point. The council pointed to what it called disgusting sex jokes, humor built around the Holocaust, mean-spirited impersonations of deaf people, and a large amount of language that had to be muted or bleeped for broadcast. This was not even a regular animated episode. It was a side project built around the same creative team, and it drew the exact same category of criticism, which suggests the issue the council saw was not limited to one format or one kind of episode. It followed the people and the sensibility behind the show wherever that sensibility showed up. Beyond yearly lists and named specials, the council targeted a very specific and practical part of how Family Guy stayed on the air, which is the money that kept it running. In 2007, the council publicly called on the Wrigley Company, a business known mainly for chewing gum and candy, to reconsider advertising during the show. Later that same year, the council made a similar public request to Burger King. In both cases, the argument was the same. These were companies whose products are popular with children, and the council argued it did not make sense for those same companies to be paying for airtime during a show filled with sexual jokes and content the council considered clearly meant for adults. This was a deliberate strategy of pressuring the show through its sponsors, rather than only complaining about the content directly to the network. If a show cannot easily be pulled off the air, pressuring the businesses that pay to appear during that show is a different way to apply pressure, and the council used that approach more than once. There is another number that puts the scale of this fight into perspective. Complaints about indecent content on American television are formally filed with the Federal Communications Commission, the government agency responsible for regulating what airs on public airwaves. Reporting at the time on how these complaints were generated found that the overwhelming majority of them, described as nearly all complaints in a specific year, close to the entire total, came from PTC members specifically, rather than from a broad spread of ordinary viewers filing complaints on their own. This detail matters because it shows that the fight over Family Guy's content was not simply a story of millions of scattered viewers separately deciding to complain. It was, in large part, one organized and persistent group using the same formal government complaint system again and again, applying steady and repeated pressure over a period of many years. Some of those formal complaints targeted specific Family Guy episodes directly, and looking at a few of them shows how consistent this pressure campaign became over time, stretching across more than a decade. The first indecency complaint connected to the show came after a rebroadcast of an episode in January of 2005. The Federal Communications Commission reviewed that complaint and denied it, ruling that the episode did not include graphic or explicit descriptions of anything sexual in a way that met the legal definition of indecent content. That ruling did not stop future complaints. Later that same year, during a period television networks call sweeps when ratings matter especially heavily, the council organized a push encouraging its members to file complaints about a specific episode that had actually satirized the FCC itself as its main storyline. In 2009, the council filed a complaint over an episode dealing with a storyline described as involving a same-sex relationship, arguing it contained sexual content that broke indecency rules. Later that same year, the council complained about a different episode after a scene showing a lap dance. In 2010, after the show reached its 150th episode, the council filed yet another complaint, this time focused on jokes involving bodily functions, with the council's president stating publicly that it seemed as though the show's creator had studied the legal definition of broadcast indecency, specifically so he could figure out exactly how far he could push right up against that line without crossing it. In 2013, the council filed a complaint about an episode it said included sexual content involving jokes about subjects like exploitation and the mistreatment of children. In 2015, the council filed a complaint about an episode built around a storyline where a main character has a sexual relationship with a teenage girl without realizing her real age until afterward. Reading through that list in order shows something important about how this entire conflict worked. It was not one big explosive event followed by silence. It was a steady, repeated cycle that played out across a full decade, one complaint after another, tied to different specific episodes, different specific storylines, and different specific legal arguments, but always aimed at the same show, filed largely by the same organization
investigation, using the same formal government process each time. At the same time all of this was happening, the show's own writers and producers were fully aware of who was watching them and why. Seth MacFarlane did not stay quiet about his feelings toward the Parents Television Council. In an interview with a magazine focused on LGBTQ issues in 2008, he described the organization in extremely harsh terms, calling them terrible people at their core, and comparing getting criticism from the group to receiving hate mail from one of history's most infamous dictators. He argued that an organization built around promoting Christian values was, in his view, spending its time focused mainly on criticizing and attacking other people, rather than living out those values in a positive way. This was not a private grumble shared only with friends. It was a public, on-the-record statement made specifically to a magazine, showing that the creative team behind the show understood exactly how much scrutiny they were under, and had no intention of quietly adjusting their approach because of it. This constant back and forth between one of television's most watched decency groups and one of television's most consistently provocative shows created something bigger than any single controversy. It created an entire ongoing storyline that ran alongside the show itself for years, a real-world subplot involving lawsuits, formal government complaints, yearly worst of lists, and public statements from both sides, running in parallel with whatever fictional storyline happened to be airing that week. Very few shows in television history have had this kind of sustained, organized, and heavily documented opposition running for so many consecutive years. Most shows that draw criticism see that criticism fade after a season or two, either because the show gets canceled or because it adjusts its content to reduce the backlash. Family Guy did neither of those things for a very long stretch of its run. The show kept airing largely the same kind of content, the council kept filing largely the same kind of complaints, and this cycle simply repeated, year after year, becoming almost a permanent fixture of how the show existed in the public eye. What makes the AIDS deathbed cutaway gag from earlier in this section such a useful starting point for understanding all of this is that it shows exactly how a single 5-second joke inside one episode could connect to something much larger. A quick joke built around a serious illness led directly to public criticism from organizations who worked with people affected by that illness. That kind of specific, targeted reaction to a specific scene fed directly into the larger pattern of organized, sustained monitoring from groups like the Parents Television Council, who were tracking not just this one moment, but the show's entire body of work, episode after episode, year after year, filing the exact kind of formal complaint that this section has walked through in detail. None of this happened in a vacuum separate from money either. Advertisers, government regulators, and organized watchdog groups were all pulling on different threads connected to the same show at the same time, and Family Guy kept running directly through the middle of all of it. The show did not soften its approach to avoid these fights. If anything, the willingness to keep making the exact kind of jokes that triggered complaint after complaint suggests the creative team saw this ongoing conflict as something closer to fuel for the show's identity rather than a problem that needed fixing. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That was not the only kind of complaint building in this early era. A separate set of concerns was growing around religion and Jewish stereotypes, serious enough that it eventually reached a real courtroom. A song built around a joke aimed at Jewish stereotypes would become the center of an actual copyright lawsuit filed over a classic piece of music the show had borrowed to build that joke. A legal fight a federal judge would take years to settle. Section 3. The song that got Family Guy sued. Most of the trouble Family Guy caused in its first several years played out in newspaper columns, television interviews, and government complaint forms. Angry words got written, angry letters got filed, and the show kept airing anyway. But one specific piece of content pushed the fight into a completely different place. A real federal courtroom with a real judge, real lawyers, and a real ruling that took years to arrive. That piece of content was a song, and the song was built entirely around a joke aimed at Jewish stereotypes. To understand how a joke inside a cartoon ended up in front of a federal judge, it helps to first understand where this particular episode came from and why it took so long to reach television screens in the first place. Family Guy's third season included an episode called When You Wish Upon a Weinstein. This episode was written and produced early in the show's run, and it was originally meant to air back in the year 2000. Instead, network executives at Fox held the episode back. The reason given at the time was concern that the content could be seen as anti-Semitic, meaning offensive or hostile toward Jewish people. This was not a small technical delay caused by a scheduling mix-up. This was a decision by the network to sit on a finished episode because the people in charge were worried about how it would be received. Considering how much other controversial material Fox had already allowed onto the air by that point, the fact that this particular episode still got pulled aside says something about how seriously the network took the specific subject matter involved. The episode eventually did air, years later than originally planned, and it included a song built around a storyline involving a Jewish character. The song was titled I Need a Jew. Inside the show's story, the song plays as part of a joke about a father wanting his son to date a Jewish girl, based on a stereotype that Jewish people are especially good with managing money. The tune the song was set to was not an original piece of music written for the show. It was set to the melody of a very well-known and beloved song called When You Wish Upon a Star, a song most famous for its connection to Disney and treasured by generations of families as a piece of gentle, hopeful music. Taking that specific melody, a song built around innocence and wishing for good things, and rewriting the words into a joke about Jewish stereotypes created a contrast that struck a nerve well beyond the usual audience of people who already expected Family Guy to push boundaries. The company that owned the rights to When You Wish Upon a Star is called The Bourne Company, a publishing house that had held the copyright to that song for decades. A copyright is a legal protection that gives the owner of a piece of creative work, like a song, control over how that work gets used, copied, or changed by other people. If someone wants to use a song that someone else owns, they typically need permission first, and in many cases, they need to pay for that permission. The Bourne Company believed Family Guy had crossed a legal line by taking their song and turning it into something else entirely without the kind of permission the law requires. On October 3rd, 2007, the Bourne Company filed a lawsuit against the people and companies behind Family Guy. The list of groups named in that lawsuit was long, and looking at exactly who was named shows how seriously the company treated this. The lawsuit named 20th Century Fox Film Corporation, Fox Broadcasting Company, 20th Century Fox Television, 20th Century Fox Home Entertainment, the production company Fuzzy Door Productions, which was founded and run by Seth MacFarlane himself, Cartoon Network, Seth MacFarlane personally, and Walter Murphy, the composer who worked on music for the show. Naming this many different companies and individuals in a single lawsuit is not something that happens over a minor disagreement. It reflects a company that believed real financial and legal harm had occurred and wanted every party connected to that harm held responsible. The specific legal claim at the center of the lawsuit was copyright infringement, which in plain terms means using someone else's protected creative work without the right kind of permission. But the lawsuit went further than simply saying the show used the song without paying for it. The Bourne Company argued that the value of their original song had been damaged specifically because of the offensive lyrics attached to the parody version used in the episode. This is an important detail because it shows the complaint was not only about money in the sense of unpaid licensing fees, it was about reputation. When You Wish Upon a Star had spent decades being associated with childhood wonder, hope, and warmth. The Bourne Company was arguing that turning that same melody into a punchline about ethnic stereotypes could damage how people thought of the original song going forward, permanently tying a beloved piece of music to something ugly it never had anything to do with. This lawsuit did not get resolved quickly. Legal cases involving copyright, especially ones involving claims about parody and comedy, often take a long time to work through the court system because judges need to weigh several different legal questions before reaching a decision. The case stretched from its filing in October of 2007 into 2009, meaning it took well over a year to reach a final ruling. The ruling finally came on March 16, 2009. A United States district judge named Deborah Batts issued the decision, and her ruling went against the Bourne Company. Judge Batts ruled that Family Guy had not committed copyright infringement when the show transformed When You Wish Upon a Star for comedic use in the episode. In plain language, the judge decided that turning a song into a parody, even an offensive one built around uncomfortable stereotypes, did not automatically count as stealing someone else's protected work in the way copyright law is meant to prevent. This outcome connects to a broader legal idea that exists specifically to protect comedy, satire, and criticism, something courts in the United States have recognized for a long time. The law generally allows creators to take a small piece of someone else's copyrighted work and use it to build a new piece of work, especially when that new work is clearly a joke, a criticism, or a transformation of the original into something different, rather than simply an attempt to copy the original and profit from it directly. This protection exists because without it, almost no comedy show, no political cartoon, and no piece of satire could ever safely reference or parody anything that already exists, since nearly all comedy depends on referencing familiar things and twisting them into something new. Judge Batts effectively ruled that Family Guy's song fell inside that protected space, even though the content of the joke itself was, by almost anyone's standard, offensive. offensive. It is worth being very clear about what this ruling did and did not decide. The judge did not rule that the joke was funny. She did not rule that the joke was tasteful, kind, or free of harmful stereotypes. She ruled specifically on a narrow legal question, whether using the melody counted as illegal copyright infringement under the specific laws that govern that kind of dispute. The show won that particular legal argument. Whether the joke itself was offensive is a completely separate question that the ruling never addressed one way or the other, because that question was never what the lawsuit was actually about. The lawsuit was about music rights and financial harm to the original song's reputation, not about whether the stereotype at the center of the joke was acceptable content for television. This distinction matters because it explains why the ruling did nothing to quiet the separate, ongoing criticism the show was facing over how it handled Jewish characters and Jewish stereotypes more broadly. The legal fight over the song was really just one piece of a much larger pattern of criticism connected to how the show approached religion and ethnicity as comedy material, a pattern that had already started back with the very first season's backlash over the episode Holy Crap and its treatment of Catholic beliefs. In November of 2009, an Australian columnist who focused on Jewish studies and culture named Dvir Abramovich wrote publicly about this pattern in Family Guy. Abramovich argued that a number of the show's episodes had gone beyond simple jokes and had actually worked to reinforce long-standing negative stereotypes about Jewish people, the kind of stereotypes that painted an entire group of people as obsessed with money or as sly and manipulative. His argument was not built around a single joke or a single episode. He was pointing to a pattern across multiple episodes over multiple years, arguing that the show had returned to these same tired and harmful ideas about Jewish people again and again, using comedy as a shield to keep repeating stereotypes that, outside of a joke format, most people would immediately recognize as prejudiced. Years later, in 2014, a different writer raised similar concerns in the Israeli newspaper Haaretz, focused on a specific scene from an episode titled 3 Acts of God. That writer argued the scene in question served as further evidence supporting a belief that Seth MacFarlane himself held long-standing anti-Semitic views, meaning views hostile or prejudiced against Jewish people specifically, rather than the criticism simply being about one isolated joke taken out of context. This claim went further than most of the criticism aimed at the show up to that point, because it was not just saying the show's jokes were offensive, it was making a direct claim about the personal beliefs of the man who created and still oversaw the show. Whether or not that specific personal claim about MacFarlane's own views was fair or accurate is something reasonable people can disagree about, and it remained a matter of opinion and argument rather than something proven in any legal or factual sense. What is not a matter of opinion is that a respected Israeli newspaper considered the question serious enough to publish, showing that concerns about the show's handling of Jewish characters and Jewish stereotypes had grown from scattered individual complaints into ongoing, serious cultural criticism discussed across multiple countries and multiple languages, not just within the United States. Taken together, these different threads, the network delaying an entire episode out of fear of exactly this kind of backlash, a major publishing company suing over a specific song built on ethnic stereotypes, a federal judge having to weigh in on where comedy legally ends and copyright theft begins, an Australian columnist accusing the show of reinforcing harmful stereotypes across multiple episodes, and an Israeli newspaper writer raising concerns about the personal views of the show's creator paint a picture of a controversy that was never really about just one joke or one episode. It was a sustained, years-long thread of concern running underneath the show's entire history, surfacing again and again in different countries, different publications, and even inside an actual American courtroom. There is something worth noticing about how differently this controversy played out compared to most of the other criticism covered so far. The Parent Television Council complaints discussed earlier in this story were aimed mainly at getting episodes flagged, getting advertisers to reconsider their support, and putting pressure on Fox as a network. Those were public pressure campaigns, loud and visible, built around getting attention and getting people to react. The lawsuit over I Need a Jew worked completely differently. It moved almost entirely through official legal channels, filed papers, court dates, and a written ruling from a judge, largely away from the noisy back and forth of press statements and television interviews that defined so much of the show's other controversies. It shows that not every fight Family Guy found itself in played out the same way. Some fights were fought in public opinion. This one was fought and ultimately settled in a federal courtroom. It also shows something about how far this show was willing to go in
in defending its own content. Rather than quietly settling the lawsuit or apologizing and pulling the joke from future rebroadcasts, the show and everyone connected to it, from the network down to the composer, fought the case all the way through to a final court ruling. That willingness to fight rather than back down lines up closely with everything else this story has already covered about how the show and its creator responded to criticism throughout its early years. Seth MacFarlane did not soften his public comments toward groups criticizing the show. Fox did not permanently cancel the series despite years of complaints. And when a real lawsuit landed over one of the show's most ethnically charged jokes, the response was not retreat. It was a legal fight that lasted well over a year and ended with a federal judge ruling in the show's favor. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That court win only settled the copyright question. It did nothing to end the wider argument about religion, ethnicity, and how far comedy should go when joking about real groups of people. Within a couple of years, that argument would collide with something bigger, a joke aimed squarely at one real, well-known family, pulling in a former political candidate, her own children, and a public fight over whether satire had turned personal. Section 4, Season 8, The Tipping Point, Part 1, Trig Palin. By the start of 2010, Family Guy had already spent more than a decade building a long list of controversies, but almost all of them followed a similar shape. A joke would touch a sensitive topic like religion, illness, or a broad group of people, and the response would come from advocacy groups, watchdog organizations, or television critics speaking on behalf of a wider cause. What happened in February of 2010 broke that pattern completely, because for the first time, the show made a joke that pointed at one specific, real, living family. And that family happened to include a woman who had run for Vice President of the United States just 2 years earlier. The episode at the center of this controversy was called Extra Large Medium, and it aired on February 14th, 2010, which was Valentine's Day. The main storyline of the episode followed Chris Griffin, the teenage son in the family, going on a date with a girl named Ellen. In the show, Ellen is written as a character with Down syndrome, a genetic condition that affects a person's physical and intellectual development. The relationship between Chris and Ellen was played mostly for sweet, awkward teenage comedy, rather than as an attack on anyone, at least on the surface. But inside that storyline, the show included one specific line that turned an ordinary date into a national news story almost overnight. At one point during the episode, Ellen describes her parents to Chris. She does not name anyone directly. She simply says that her father is an accountant and her mother is the former governor of Alaska. The show never says the name Sarah Palin at any point in the episode. It did not need to. By February of 2010, there was only one former governor of Alaska who had recently become a nationally famous political figure, and that was Sarah Palin, who would run alongside John McCain as the Republican candidate for vice president in the 2008 presidential election. Palin's youngest son, Trig, was born in 2008, during the campaign itself, and Trig has Down syndrome. The connection between the fictional character Ellen's line about her mother and the real-life Palin family was not subtle. It was built to be instantly recognizable to anyone who had followed recent American politics, and it landed exactly the way it was clearly designed to land. The reaction from the Palin family came fast, and it came first from Sarah Palin's daughter Bristol, who was 19 years old at the time. Bristol wrote a public response, describing it as a much more calm and polite statement than her mother wanted to make personally, which already signals how strong the family's private reaction must have been behind the scenes. In her statement, Bristol asked whether there were any limits at all to what people would say about her younger brother, or about other people connected to what she called the special needs community. She argued that the writers behind the episode believed they were being clever by mocking her brother and her family, and she stated flatly that all they had actually proven was that they were, in her words, heartless jerks. Sarah Palin herself did not stay quiet either. She posted about the episode on her Facebook page, describing the experience of watching it as feeling like another kick in the gut. That specific choice of words, a kick in the gut, suggests something more personal and physical than simple political annoyance. It reads like the reaction of a parent, not a politician issuing a prepared statement. Palin also took her frustration onto national television, appearing on the Fox News program The O'Reilly Factor. During that appearance, she referred to the people responsible for the show as cruel and cold-hearted, and she asked, in front of a national television audience, when enough would finally be enough, arguing that some things simply are not funny, no matter how they are framed as comedy. It is worth pausing here to notice how this specific controversy differed from almost everything covered earlier earlier in this story. The AIDS deathbed cutaway gag drew criticism from organizations built around supporting people affected by AIDS as a whole. The lawsuit over the song mocking Jewish stereotypes was fought using formal legal arguments inside a courtroom.
Both of those controversies, as serious as they were, stayed at something close to an institutional level. Groups responding on behalf of communities, lawyers responding on behalf of companies. The Palin controversy was different because it played out through two individual women, a mother and her daughter, speaking directly and personally about their own family, using their own names on their own social media accounts and in their own television appearances. This was not a distant watchdog group filing a written complaint through a government form. This was a well-known public figure and her teenage daughter responding in real time to a joke they felt had targeted their own child and brother specifically. Family Guy's creator, Seth MacFarlane, did respond to the growing controversy, though his response leaned more toward defending the show's overall approach than directly apologizing for the specific joke. MacFarlane argued that the show built its comedy around sharp satire, and he described Family Guy as what he called an equal opportunity offender, meaning a show that makes fun of every group and every kind of person without singling any one group out for special treatment. This idea of being an equal opportunity offender became something close to an unofficial defense the show and its supporters would return to again and again whenever new controversies popped up in later years. The idea being that if a show makes fun of everyone equally, it becomes harder to argue that any one joke reflects genuine hostility toward any specific group. MacFarlane also pushed back directly on how the Palin family had framed their own outrage, suggesting that their reaction assumed a kind of authority to speak for and defend people with Down syndrome broadly, an authority he did not believe the situation actually called for. The most surprising and most widely discussed part of this entire controversy, though, did not come from Seth MacFarlane at all. It came from the actress who actually voiced the character of Ellen in the episode. Her name is Andrea Faye Friedman, and at the time of the episode, she was 39 years old. Friedman herself has Down syndrome, and she had built a real career as a working actress and public speaker, having appeared in other television shows and having spent years giving talks around the world specifically about living with Down syndrome. Her connection to this storyline was not incidental. She was not simply a voice hired to read lines written by someone else with no personal stake in the subject. She was a professional performer who had built her entire public life around representing people with Down syndrome honestly and with dignity, and she had chosen, as an adult making her own decisions, to take this specific role. After Sarah Palin and Bristol Palin criticized the episode publicly, Friedman responded directly, and her response reframed the entire controversy in a way almost nobody had expected. In a statement she gave to the New York Times, Friedman said that former Governor Palin did not appear to have a sense of humor. She explained that she personally found the specific line about her character's mother being the former governor of Alaska very funny, and she pointed out plainly that the entire point of that line was sarcasm, a joke built at Sarah Palin's expense specifically, rather than a joke built at the expense of her son. Friedman did not stop there. In a separate interview, she went even further, directly criticizing Sarah Palin's own public behavior involving her son. Friedman said she was personally angry at Palin, not because of anything connected to the Family Guy episode itself, but because of how she felt Palin used her son Trig as what she called a political prop, meaning a public prop or symbol used to help win sympathy or support from voters. Friedman argued that Trig deserved to be treated as a completely normal child, rather than being carried around, in her words, like a loaf of French bread, used essentially as a visual aid held up for the benefit of Palin's political career. This was an extraordinarily direct and personal criticism, made by a woman who herself has Down syndrome, aimed specifically at how a mother had chosen to publicly present her own son with the same condition. Friedman closed her comments by describing her own upbringing, saying that her parents had raised her to have a sense of humor and to live what she called a normal life, drawing a clear and pointed contrast between how she felt she had been raised and how she believed Palin was choosing to present her son to the public. This response completely changed the shape of the public conversation. Before Friedman spoke publicly, the story was fairly simple. A cartoon show had made an unkind joke about a child with a disability, and a mother was rightly upset on her son's behalf. After Friedman spoke publicly, the story became far more complicated, because now the very actress who has Down syndrome and who voiced the character at the center of the joke was arguing that the joke had never actually been about the child at all, and was instead pushing back personally against the mother's own choices in how she handled her son's public image. Media coverage of the controversy shifted noticeably after this, with multiple outlets picking up Friedman's comments comments and treating them as a serious and legitimate counterpoint to the Palin family's criticism, rather than simply an interesting side note. The controversy also reached late-night television directly. On February 19, 2010, Seth MacFarlane appeared as a guest on the HBO program Real Time with Bill Maher, where he discussed the controversy in front of a live audience. His appearance there gave him a chance to explain his side of the argument directly to viewers, rather than only through short written statements picked up secondhand by news outlets, further extending how long this particular story stayed in the public conversation. Coverage of this entire episode was not limited to entertainment news either. Major mainstream outlets treated it as a real news story worth serious coverage, not just a passing pop culture moment. ABC News ran a detailed report on the growing conflict between Palin and MacFarlane, describing it as a war of words playing out between the two sides. CBS News also covered Friedman's response directly, publishing a piece specifically focused on her statement that Palin appeared to lack a sense of humor. Even Time magazine, a publication known mainly for serious news and world events rather than entertainment gossip, included this controversy on a list ranking some of the most controversial moments involving cartoons, treating a single line from an animated sitcom as significant enough to sit alongside other major examples of controversial media. One detail that deserves close attention is exactly how the joke was constructed in the first place. The show never used Sarah Palin's real name. It never showed any character resembling her physically. It relied entirely on one small biographical detail: a mother described as a former governor of Alaska, to make the entire connection clear to anyone paying attention to American politics at the time. This kind of joke depends completely on audience knowledge outside the show itself. Someone unfamiliar with Sarah Palin's political career, or unaware that her son has Down syndrome, would have had no way of even recognizing that the line was a reference to a real person at all. That single detail is part of why this controversy became so significant in the show's overall history. It marked one of the clearest examples yet of the show building a joke specifically designed to be decoded by an audience already following current political news, rather than functioning as a standalone joke that worked on its own terms, regardless of outside context. It is also worth noting how quickly this controversy escalated once it started. The episode aired on a Sunday night. By that same week, Bristol Palin had already published her written response. Sarah Palin's Facebook post and her appearance on Fox News followed within days. Friedman's response to the New York Times came shortly after that. MacFarlane's appearance on Real Time with Bill Maher followed within roughly a week of the episode's original air date. In less than 2 weeks, this single line of dialogue had moved through social media, cable news, print journalism, and late-night television, pulling in a former vice presidential candidate, her college-aged daughter, a professional actress with a public platform built around disability advocacy, and the creator of the show himself, all responding publicly and by name. This entire episode also revealed something important about how difficult it can be to draw a clean, simple lesson from any single Family Guy controversy. On one hand, a mother and her daughter felt genuinely hurt on behalf of a young child who could not speak for himself, and their reaction reflected real, personal pain rather than manufactured political outrage. On the other hand, the one person most directly connected to the actual subject matter of the joke, a grown woman with Down syndrome who had spent her career advocating for people with that same condition, argued publicly that the joke was never really about the child at all, and instead used the moment to raise her own serious concerns about how that child was being used in public life by his own mother. Both of those reactions were genuine, both were widely reported, and neither one simply cancels out the other. The controversy did not resolve into one clear right side and one clear wrong side. It stayed messy and split, exactly the kind of outcome that made this specific incident different from many of the show's earlier controversies, where advocacy groups and watchdog organizations tended to speak with a single, unified voice against the show. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. This all happened in February 2010, right at the start of Season 8. Instead of slowing down after the Palin backlash, the show moved almost immediately into another deeply personal subject, this time centered on a woman who had already died 5 years earlier after a medical and legal battle that had split the entire country long before Family Guy ever touched it. Section 5, Season 8, Part 2, the Terry Schiavo musical number. The Palin controversy from earlier in Season 8 had barely settled down when Family Guy moved into a second, deeply personal storyline, this time built around a woman who was no longer alive to respond to any of it herself. Her name was Terry Schiavo, and her case had already become one of the most emotional and widely followed medical and legal fights in recent American history, long before the show ever touched the subject. The fact that the show moved from one intensely personal controversy straight into another within the same handful of weeks is worth keeping in mind throughout this entire section, because it shows a pattern pattern of behavior rather than a single, isolated decision made by one writer on one particular day. To understand why this joke hit so many people so hard, it helps to know the real story behind Terri Schiavo first, completely separate from anything Family Guy did with it later. Terri Schiavo suffered a heart problem in 1990 that cut off oxygen to her brain for an extended period of time. This kind of injury, where the brain is deprived of oxygen for too long, can cause permanent and severe damage, and in Schiavo's case, it left her in what doctors call a persistent vegetative state, a serious medical condition where a person's body continues basic functions like breathing and digestion, but the person shows no meaningful awareness of their surroundings and cannot communicate in any reliable way. She remained in this exact condition for 15 years, kept alive through a feeding tube rather than through any ability to eat or care for herself. 15 years is an extraordinarily long stretch of time for any family to live inside this kind of uncertainty, watching a loved one exist in a state where recovery seemed unlikely, but where death had also not come.
During those 15 years, her husband and her parents became locked in a long and bitter legal battle over what should happen to her, a conflict that grew more public and more contentious as the years dragged on. Her husband argued that she would not have wanted to be kept alive indefinitely through artificial feeding, believing he understood her true wishes better than anyone else involved. Her parents argued the opposite, believing she could still recover given enough time and care, and insisting she should be kept alive no matter how long that took or how uncertain the odds of recovery actually were. This fight did not stay contained within one courtroom or one family conversation. It went through multiple courts over the years, with judges repeatedly asked to rule on what should happen next. It drew direct involvement from the governor of Florida at the time, who became personally engaged in trying to influence the outcome.
It even reached the United States Congress, where lawmakers took the unusual step of getting involved in what was, at its core, a deeply personal family dispute over one specific woman's medical care. Very few individual medical cases in American history have ever pulled in a state governor and the federal legislature at the same time. And the fact that Schiavo's case did exactly that shows how large and how divisive it had already become well before Family Guy ever touched the subject. Terri Schiavo eventually died in 2005, 5 full years before this particular Family Guy episode aired, meaning the show was not reacting to a fresh, ongoing news story when it built a joke around her case. It was returning, years later, to a subject that had already fully played out in the public eye and had already ended in her death. Her case had already deeply divided the American public along religious and political lines long before any cartoon touched it, with debates touching on end-of-life care, disability rights, and how much government involvement is appropriate in deeply personal family decisions about medical treatment. People who otherwise disagreed about almost everything else in politics often found themselves aligned in unexpected ways over the Schiavo case specifically, because the questions it raised about when life support should continue, about who gets to decide for someone who cannot decide for themselves, and about how much the government should involve itself in that decision, cut across normal political lines in ways that few other issues of that era did. This is the emotional and political backdrop that already existed, fully formed, 5 years before Family Guy decided to build a joke around it. The Family Guy episode connected to this subject was called Peter-assment, and it aired in March of 2010, part of the same 8th season that had already produced the Palin controversy just weeks earlier. Inside the episode, there is a scene showing Stewie's preschool class putting on a play in front of an audience of parents, the kind of small, cute performance young children often put on at school events. The play the children perform, though, is built around Terri Schiavo's case specifically, and it includes a song with lyrics describing her as, in the show's own words, kind of alive-o, and also describing her, again using the show's own language, as the most expensive plant anyone would ever see. The scene stages very young children, characters written and drawn to look like actual preschoolers, performing a musical number that jokes directly about a real woman's death, her 15 years spent in a vegetative state, and the massive medical costs involved in keeping her alive during that time. The choice to put these specific words into the mouths of small children performing on a stage adds a particular kind of discomfort to the joke that a joke delivered by an adult character might not have carried in the same way, since it stages innocence itself as the vehicle for mocking a real and painful death. The reaction to this scene came from multiple directions almost immediately, and unlike the Palin controversy, which centered mainly on one family speaking for themselves in response to a joke aimed at their own relative, this backlash pulled in religious commentators, disability advocates, and Schiavo's own surviving family family members, each objecting for a slightly different reason rooted in a different set of concerns. This spread of criticism across several separate groups, rather than one single family responding, is itself a meaningful difference from the earlier controversy that same season, and it shows how many different angles this specific joke managed to touch at once. A writer named Wesley J. Smith, writing for a publication called First Things, described the scene in extremely harsh terms, characterizing it as something close to hate speech directed at Schiavo. His piece treated the scene not as an isolated joke in poor taste that could simply be brushed aside, but as something reflecting a much deeper disrespect toward a woman who had already suffered greatly during her life and had already died, unable in any sense to defend herself from being turned into a punchline years after her death had already occurred. Smith's framing placed this joke in a different category than ordinary bad taste, treating it instead as an example of using comedy to attack someone who could never respond, correct the record, or push back in any way. Separately, a blogger named Jill Stanek covered the scene under a piece she titled Terri Schiavo the Musical, treating the very existence of a musical number built around this specific tragedy as self-evidently outrageous, needing little further explanation beyond simply describing what the show had actually done. The choice of title alone, framing an entire serious human tragedy as a musical, was meant to highlight just how strange and unsettling the pairing of subject matter and format really was, without needing to spell out in detail why that pairing felt wrong to her and to many of her readers. Beyond individual commentators writing on their own platforms, organized protest followed as well, extending this backlash beyond individual writers into groups with a wider base of members and supporters. The American Life League, a group focused on issues connected to the protection of human life, including opposition to withdrawing medical care from patients like Schiavo, joined the criticism of the episode directly. Their involvement connected this Family Guy controversy directly to the same larger political and religious debate that had already surrounded Schiavo's real case for 15 years, meaning this was not simply a fight about comedy and good taste playing out in isolation from anything else. It was an extension of a debate that had already split the country over questions of disability, medical treatment, and when, if ever, a family should be allowed to end life-sustaining care for a loved one who cannot speak for themselves. For a group already deeply invested in that larger debate, this episode was not just an unfunny joke. It was, in their eyes, a mainstream television show taking one specific side of an already painful national argument and mocking the side associated with keeping Schiavo alive as long as possible. The most personal and painful response, though, came from Terri Schiavo's own family, the people who had actually lived through her 15-year ordeal from beginning to end. Her brother, Bobby Schindler Jr., spoke out directly against the episode in public statements following its broadcast. Rather than simply criticizing this one specific joke as tasteless or unfair, Schindler went further and publicly urged Fox to cancel Family Guy entirely, treating the single episode as reason enough to end the entire show, rather than simply address this one storyline on its own. This request mirrors almost exactly what the Parents Television Council had already asked for a full decade earlier, back in the year 2000, when that organization first launched its own campaign asking Fox to cancel the show completely. The similarity between these two requests, separated by 10 years, is notable, though this time the request came not from an organized watchdog group with a long-standing institutional mission built around monitoring television content, but from a grieving family member reacting personally to his own sister's death being turned into entertainment for a preschool play song inside a cartoon. It is worth pausing on how different this particular reaction was compared to the Palin controversy that had happened just weeks before it in the same season. Sarah Palin and Bristol Palin were responding on behalf of a living child who could grow up, who could eventually understand what had been said about him as he got older, and who might one day form his own opinion about the joke made at his expense. Bobby Schindler was responding on behalf of a sister who had already been gone for 5 years, who could never respond, defend herself, or move past what had been said about her in any way, and whose entire 15-year ordeal, culminating in a death that tore her own family apart through years of legal fighting between her husband and her parents, was now being condensed into a single, mocking song performed by cartoon preschoolers for a laugh. There is an argument that jokes about the dead carry a different weight than jokes about the living, since the person being joked about has no ability to respond, correct the record, explain their own side, or even feel hurt in the moment, the way a living person can. Whether or not that argument holds up under close scrutiny, it clearly shaped how personally and how seriously Schiavo's own brother took this particular episode, choosing to speak out publicly rather than let the joke pass without any comment at all, even though doing so meant reliving, at least briefly, one of the most painful chapters of his own family's history in front of a national audience. The criticisms surrounding this episode also touched a second, closely connected issue, beyond simply mocking Schiavo personally as an individual, which was the show's treatment of disability and brain injury more broadly as categories of human experience. Because Schiavo's condition stemmed directly from a serious brain injury, protests connected to this episode came specifically from people and groups concerned with how the entertainment industry portrays brain injuries and the people living with them in general, not only in this one specific case. These protesters argued that turning Schiavo's medical condition into a punchline sent a harmful message more broadly, suggesting that people with severe brain injuries, and by extension, their ongoing medical care and their basic human worth as people, could be treated as an acceptable target for cheap laughs, rather than treated with the seriousness that any medical tragedy involving real human suffering deserves. This argument extended the controversy beyond Schiavo's individual story, and connected it to a wider concern about how television in general chooses to depict conditions like hers, a concern that would remain relevant regardless of whether any future show ever referenced Schiavo by name again. Taken together, the reaction to this episode reveals something slightly different from the pattern seen in the Palin controversy just a few weeks earlier in the very same season. The Palin backlash was largely a personal and political fight between one family and the show's creator, eventually complicated by an unexpected and widely covered counter-voice from the actress who had voiced the joke's central character, someone with a direct personal stake in the subject who ended up disagreeing publicly with the family's framing of the joke. The Schiavo backlash, by contrast, pulled together several separate threads at once: religious commentary focused on the sanctity of life, organized advocacy connected to a specific and long-running political cause, direct grief and anger from a surviving family member who had lived through the entire 15-year ordeal firsthand, and broader concern from disability advocates about how brain injuries get portrayed on television more generally. These threads did not all come from the same place, did not all share the exact same underlying argument, and did not all represent people who would necessarily agree with each other on every other political or religious question. But they arrived at almost the same time, clustered tightly around the same single episode, creating a much wider and more varied wave of criticism than the Palin joke alone had produced just weeks earlier, even though both controversies erupted within the same handful of weeks at the start of the very same season. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. These two controversies landed within roughly a month of each other at the very start of Season 8, one aimed at a living child, the other at a woman already 5 years gone. It was only the beginning. Later that same season, the network itself would refuse to let a finished episode air on American television at all. Section 6. The episode Fox wouldn't air. Season 8 had already produced two of the most personally painful controversies in the show's history within a single month, one connected to a living child and a former vice presidential candidate, the other connected to a woman who had died 5 years earlier after a case that had split the entire country. Both of those controversies followed a familiar pattern. An episode aired, people reacted strongly, statements were exchanged, and the show simply moved on to the next week. The final controversy of that same season broke that pattern entirely, because for the first time in the show's history, an episode was fully finished and ready to air, and the network chose not to let American audiences see it through a normal broadcast at all. The episode is called Partial Terms of Endearment, and it was produced as the closing episode of Season 8. Rather than airing on schedule like every other episode before it, Fox pulled it from the lineup, and it never received a broadcast on American television during its original run. To understand why this specific episode crossed a line that years of jokes about AIDS, religion, and real living families had not managed to cross, it helps to look closely at what actually happens inside the story. The plot follows Lois, the mother of the Griffin family, agreeing to act as a surrogate for a couple who are close friends of hers. A surrogate is a woman who carries a pregnancy for someone else who cannot have children on their own, with the understanding that the baby will be handed over to the intended parents after birth. Lois takes on this role purely out of generosity, planning to carry the child for 9 months and then hand over a healthy baby to two people who desperately want to become parents. Partway through the pregnancy, the story shifts into much darker territory. The couple Lois is carrying the child for are killed in a car accident. This single event completely changes Lois's situation. She is no longer a woman helping a friend for 9 months before handing off a healthy newborn. She is pregnant with a child who has no parents left to receive it, and the show builds its entire second half around the difficult decision that follows from that fact, showing Lois and her husband Peter debating whether she should continue the pregnancy or end it, weighing the reality of raising a a child that was never meant to be theirs against the alternative of ending a pregnancy that no longer has the two parents it was originally created for. This storyline placed the show directly inside the subject of abortion, one of the most emotionally charged and politically divided topics in American life. Unlike most of the show's earlier controversial jokes, which lasted a few seconds inside a cutaway gag before the story moved on to something else, this was not a quick joke dropped into an unrelated plot. Abortion was the actual main storyline of the entire episode, discussed and debated by the show's two lead characters for the full runtime, using the show's usual irreverent sense of humor while still keeping the core subject front and center, rather than treating it as a passing reference. Coverage of the episode consistently describes it as approaching the topic from multiple directions, rather than picking one clear side. Reporting on the episode notes that it pokes fun at both sides of the abortion debate, representing several different viewpoints on the issue without the show settling firmly on any single position as the correct one. This detail matters because it shows the episode was not simply a one-sided political statement dressed up as comedy.
It was structured more like a satire, trying to find humor in every angle of an argument that, outside of comedy, rarely allows for much middle ground at all. Despite that balanced structure, Fox made the decision to prevent the episode from airing in the United States. Reporting on the decision places this at the very end of Season 8 in 2010, describing it plainly as a domestic network ban, meaning the episode was blocked specifically from broadcast within the United States, even though the episode had already been fully written, animated, and completed like any other episode of the show. What makes this decision especially notable is how it compares to everything else covered earlier in this story. Fox had already allowed the network to air a cutaway gag showing men singing and dancing around the bed of a man dying of AIDS. Fox had already allowed a joke aimed directly at a former vice presidential candidate's son with Down syndrome. Fox had already allowed a musical number mocking a real woman who had died after 15 years in a vegetative state, performed by cartoon preschoolers just weeks earlier in that same season. All of those episodes made it to air, controversy and all. Partial terms of endearment did not. Something about this specific episode pushed past whatever threshold the network had been willing to tolerate through years of far-reaching jokes about serious and painful subjects. The episode did not simply disappear forever, however. While it never received a standard American broadcast, it was still made available to audiences in other ways. Reporting confirms that the episode aired in other countries outside the United States, meaning American viewers were, in an unusual twist, the one audience Fox specifically chose to shield from this particular episode, even as international broadcasters aired it without the same restriction. The episode was also eventually included as part of the complete Season 8 box set released on DVD, meaning viewers who purchased the physical collection of that season could still watch it at home, even though it had never aired through a normal television broadcast. This detail about the DVD release matters because it shows the decision to block the episode was not really about hiding the content from existing fans altogether. Fans could still buy the season and watch it. The decision was specifically about keeping the episode off broadcast television, the platform reaching the widest and most general audience, including viewers who might stumble onto the show while flipping channels rather than deliberately seeking it out. This distinction suggests Fox's concern was less about whether the content should exist at all, and more about controlling exactly how and to whom it reached its widest possible audience. Multiple entertainment outlets that have looked back at the show's history describe partial terms of endearment using very specific language, consistently calling it the only Family Guy episode ever banned from American broadcast television. This distinction is repeated across several separate sources covering the show's history, each independently landing on the same basic description, an episode that still, even years later, holds the unique status of never having aired domestically on the network that produced it. One detailed retrospective covering the show's darkest episodes describes this ban as especially unusual because of exactly when it happened. According to that coverage, this episode holds the distinct reputation of being the only Family Guy episode banned, even before its scheduled release date, meaning Fox did not simply pull the episode after a poor reaction from an initial airing, the way it had done years earlier with the Boston Marathon-related episode covered later in this story. The network made the decision to block it before American audiences ever had the chance to see it through a normal broadcast at all, a much more preemptive and deliberate choice than reacting after the fact to public backlash. This same retrospective also offers a useful and balanced description of the episode's actual quality and tone, separate from the controversy surrounding it. The coverage describes the episode as, overall, smartly written and genuinely funny, while also acknowledging that it unfortunately goes a little too far past the line for most viewers who simply were not ready for its subject matter. This kind of description matters because it shows that even people looking back at the episode with some appreciation for its writing and humor still recognize that the subject matter itself, regardless of how well the jokes were constructed around it, was simply too heavy and too direct
directly tied to real-world abortion debates for general broadcast audiences to be considered a safe fit. Placing this episode alongside the two controversies that came just weeks before it in the same season paints a clear picture of how far the show had traveled by this specific point in its run. The season had opened with a joke referencing a living child connected to a former vice presidential candidate, drawing personal statements from that candidate and her daughter. It continued with a musical number mocking a woman who had died years earlier after one of the most emotionally divisive medical and legal fights in recent American history, drawing criticism from religious groups, disability advocates, and the woman's own grieving brother. And it closed with an entire episode built around the subject of abortion, tied specifically to a fictional pregnancy that only became morally complicated because both biological parents had suddenly died. A storyline so heavy that the network that had tolerated everything else that season chose to keep it off American television screens entirely. It is worth being precise about what this ban does and does not represent. This was not a case of government regulators stepping in, the way the Federal Communications Commission had done with earlier formal indecency complaints discussed previously in this story. This was not a case of a court ruling against the show, the way it happened with the copyright lawsuit over the Jewish Stereotype song. This was simply Fox, the network itself, making an internal decision that this particular episode, despite being fully finished and ready to broadcast just like any other, was not something they were willing to put on American television during its regular scheduled slot. That kind of network self-censorship is different from outside pressure forcing a change. It reflects the people running the network itself deciding on their own judgment that this specific piece of content crossed a line their own standards were not willing to cross, even after years of allowing nearly everything else to make it to air. This single decision also stands as one of the clearest, most concrete pieces of evidence available anywhere in the show's entire history for the idea that Family Guy pushed its content further and further as its seasons went on. It is one thing to point to individual jokes that upset individual groups or individual families, since reasonable people can debate endlessly about where exactly personal taste and comedy overlap. It is a completely different kind of evidence when the network airing the show, the same network that had already broadcast years of AIDS jokes, religious mockery, and jokes aimed at real living children, looked at a finished episode centered on abortion and decided, on its own, that this particular piece of content should never reach American television screens at all. If a network with years of experience clearing increasingly extreme content for broadcast still drew a hard line at this specific episode, that decision says something meaningful about just how far the show's content had traveled by the closing episode of its 8th season. A season that had already opened with two of the most personal and painful controversies in the show's entire run. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Season 8 closed with this unprecedented network ban, but the show's willingness to test boundaries around real-world tragedy did not end there. Just 3 years later, a single cutaway gag would collide with an actual act of terrorism happening in real time, forcing the show to confront the difference between joking about a fictional disaster and having that same joke line up days later with a real one. Section 7. Violence against women as a running bit. The network ban on partial terms of endearment closed out Season 8 as a moment where the show's own network drew a hard line. Season 10 opened a different kind of conversation entirely. One that had nothing to do with a single banned episode and everything to do with a pattern spread across dozens of episodes. A pattern focused specifically on how often the show's female characters ended up as targets of violence, played for laughs. The episode most directly connected to this conversation is called Screams of Silence, the story of Brenda Q, which aired in the show's 10th season during 2011, timed to air around Halloween as part of Fox's regular Halloween programming block. The character at the center of the episode is Brenda Q, a recurring character on the show who is in a relationship with a man named Jeff. The episode's plot centers on Jeff abusing Brenda, showing scenes of domestic violence between the two characters, presented within the show's usual comedic format. Reaction to this episode came fast, and it came from media commentators who cover entertainment and pop culture professionally, not from outside advocacy groups reacting to a single joke buried inside an unrelated storyline. This is an important difference from many of the controversies covered earlier in this story. The AIDS deathbed joke and the Boston Marathon episode discussed later both involved brief cutaway gags dropped into otherwise unrelated plots. This episode built an entire storyline around domestic violence as its main subject, which meant critics had far more material to respond to than just one quick joke. A.J. Hammer, a host on the entertainment news program Showbiz Tonight, spoke about the episode directly on air. He described his own reaction reaction plainly, saying he was shocked by what he saw, and he called the episode a genuinely depressing half hour of television. Coming from someone whose job involves covering entertainment news regularly, and who would have already been familiar with the show's usual style of humor, this reaction stands out. Hammer was not someone unfamiliar with dark or edgy comedy encountering Family Guy for the first time. He was a seasoned entertainment commentator, specifically singling this episode out as unusually bleak, even by the standards of a show already known for pushing boundaries. A writer named Whitney Jefferson, writing for the feminist-focused website Jezebel, covered the episode with equally strong language. Jefferson explained that she had personally stopped watching the show years earlier, describing herself as having grown numb to what she called shock value offensiveness long before this particular episode aired. This detail matters because it shows Jefferson was not someone easily rattled by edgy content in general. She had already built up a kind of resistance to the show's usual approach to controversial material. Despite that resistance, she found herself tuning back in, specifically because the show was airing a Halloween-themed special that night, something she had a personal fondness for. What she found instead of a fun Halloween episode was, in her own description, seriously awful. She closed her review by calling it, without any hint of exaggeration in her tone, definitely the scariest Halloween special the show had ever produced, though clearly not scary in the way a Halloween episode is supposed to be. Beyond this single episode, a broader argument began forming around the show's overall pattern of depicting violence against its female characters, not just in this one storyline, but stretched across the entire run of the series. A piece published by Vice magazine laid out this argument using a specific and very concrete method. The writer explained they tried counting how many episodes in a row they could watch before finding one that did not include some act of violence against a woman. According to that count, they managed to get through 14 consecutive episodes before finding a single 20-minute episode that did not feature Meg, Lois, or another female character being knocked to the ground, murdered, or slapped. This detail is worth sitting with carefully, because it changes the entire nature of the criticism being made. Every controversy covered earlier in this story, the AIDS joke, the Palin joke, the Schiavo musical number, the abortion storyline, involved one specific episode or one specific joke that caused a specific and identifiable reaction. This Vice article was making a completely different kind of argument. It was not saying that one particular episode crossed a line. It was arguing that violence against women was so common and so consistently present across the show's episodes that a viewer could watch 14 episodes in a row, nearly 5 hours of television, before encountering even a single episode without some form of physical violence directed at a female character. 14 episodes is not a small sample. A modern season of Family Guy typically contains somewhere between 14 and 22 episodes, meaning this count is roughly equivalent to an entire season's worth of episodes. If someone sat down and watched close to a full season of the show back to back, according to this specific accounting, they would likely see a female character knocked down, hurt, or killed in almost every single episode along the way, with maybe one exception buried somewhere in that stretch. This pattern connects directly to something worth revisiting from earlier controversies covered in this story. The Terry Schiavo musical number targeted a woman specifically. The domestic violence storyline in the Brenda Q episode targeted a woman specifically. Even the earlier AIDS deathbed joke, while centered on a man, fits into a broader pattern the show would return to again and again throughout its run, taking the most painful and vulnerable moments a person can experience and turning those moments into comedy. What the Vice count adds to this picture is scale. It suggests that when it came specifically to violence directed at women, this was not an occasional dark joke that popped up here and there across the show's long history. It was closer to a constant, familiar background feature of the show's regular writing, something so routine that finding an episode without it became the unusual outcome rather than the expected one. It is worth being fair and precise about what this specific piece of criticism does and does not claim. The Vice count was not built as a formal academic study using strict scientific methods, and it does not claim to represent every single episode across the show's entire multi-decade run with perfect precision. It represents one writer's own personal viewing experience, counted and described honestly, used to support a broader argument the writer was making about a pattern they had noticed while genuinely trying to watch the show. That distinction matters because it separates this kind of criticism from the more formal complaints filed with government regulators or lawsuits filed in actual courtrooms covered earlier in this story. This was cultural criticism, built from direct personal observation, published for readers to consider and judge for themselves, rather than something decided through a legal or regulatory process. Still, the specific specific and countable nature of the claim gives it a different kind of weight compared to more general complaints about a show simply being offensive or crude. Saying a show is offensive in general terms is a vague claim that different viewers might disagree about depending entirely on their own personal taste and sense of humor. Saying that a viewer specifically counted 14 consecutive episodes before finding one without violence against a woman is a claim built on direct observation, something other viewers could, in theory, sit down and check for themselves simply by watching the same stretch of episodes and counting along. Looking back across the earlier sections of this story, the Brenda Q episode and the broader pattern the Vice article identified reveal a different kind of escalation compared to what came before it. The Palin joke and the Shivo musical number were both built around single, specific, real-world references, a real family and a real deceased woman, respectively. The Brenda Q episode, by contrast, targeted a completely fictional character, someone who existed only within the show's own universe, with no real family able to respond publicly, and no real advocacy group built specifically around her individual story. And yet, the reaction to this fictional storyline was, according to entertainment commentators covering it directly, just as strong, and in some ways described in even bleaker terms than reactions tied to jokes about real, living, or recently deceased people. This suggests something important about how this particular type of criticism worked. It was not solely about whether a real person or a real family had been personally hurt by a specific joke. It was increasingly about a broader pattern of how an entire group, women as a whole, kept getting treated across the show's writing, episode after episode, year after year, regardless of whether any single episode involved a real-world reference at all. This particular thread of criticism, focused on patterns rather than single episodes, sat quietly alongside the show's other controversies for years, without producing the same kind of single, dramatic headline moment that the Palin joke or the network ban on partial terms of endearment had produced. There was no lawsuit connected to it. There was no formal government complaint tied specifically to this broader pattern, the way there had been with individual episodes discussed earlier. It existed instead as an ongoing, quieter argument running underneath the show's entire history, occasionally surfacing in pieces like the Vice article, but never fully resolving into one single defining moment the way some of the show's other controversies eventually did. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That would soon change, though not because of another fictional storyline built entirely inside the show's own universe. 2 years after the Brenda Q backlash, a single cutaway gag depicting a fictional disaster would collide directly with a real act of violence happening in the actual world, forcing the show to confront, for the first time, what happens when a joke about an imagined tragedy suddenly lines up almost exactly with a real one. Section 8. When a joke collided with real tragedy. The Brenda Q backlash and the broader pattern of violence against women covered in the previous section built up slowly, spread across years of episodes and quiet cultural criticism. What happened in the spring of 2013 was completely different. A single joke, already broadcast and already forgotten by most viewers, suddenly collided with a real event happening in the actual world, and the timing turned an old, unremarkable cutaway gag into one of the most talked about controversies in the show's entire history. The episode connected to this story is called Turban Cowboy, and it aired on March 17th, 2013. Inside the episode, the show included one of its usual cutaway gags, a short and disconnected joke lasting only a few seconds before the main story continued. This particular cutaway showed Peter Griffin winning the Boston Marathon, a real annual race held in the city of Boston, by driving his car through the runners rather than actually running the race himself. The joke, dark as it was, followed the same basic format the show had used for its cutaway gags since its very first season, taking an unrelated and absurd idea, showing it briefly, and moving on without connecting it to anything else in the episode's plot. At the time the episode aired, this joke drew little special attention. It was simply one more dark cutaway gag inside a show that had built its entire identity around exactly this kind of humor, and it aired and passed without becoming any kind of major news story on its own. Everything changed about 1 month later. On April 15th, 2013, a real bombing attack took place at the actual Boston Marathon, a serious act of terrorism that killed people and injured many more at a real-world event that draws hundreds of thousands of spectators every year. This was a genuine tragedy, not a fictional storyline, and it dominated national news coverage for days afterward as investigators worked to identify who was responsible. In the days following the real bombing, someone took the old Turban Cowboy cutaway gag and edited it, splicing together pieces of the original clip to make it look far more similar to the actual bombing than the original joke had ever actually shown. Coverage explaining exactly what this edited version looked like described a fake news interview showing Peter Griffin, framed as the marathon winner, being asked by an interviewer how he managed his win. In the doctored clip, Peter answers by pulling out a phone, dialing a number, and setting off an explosion, then complaining that his phone must be broken before dialing again and triggering a second explosion. None of this exact sequence, involving a phone and two separate explosions, actually appeared in the original broadcast episode. It had been built specifically after the real bombing, using pieces of the original Family Guy footage stitched together in a new order to create something that looked disturbingly like it had predicted the real attack weeks in advance. This edited clip spread rapidly online, picked up by people who believed, or wanted others to believe, that Family Guy had somehow known about or predicted the real bombing before it happened. This kind of thinking follows a pattern seen after many major tragedies, where people search for hidden warnings or predictions in unrelated media from before the event, even when those supposed connections require significant editing or reinterpretation to actually line up. Seth MacFarlane responded directly and quickly once the doctored clip started spreading widely. He posted a message on social media condemning the edited version in blunt terms, describing it as abhorrent. He made clear that the actual bombing was a real crime and a real tragedy, and he stated that his thoughts were with the people who had been hurt by it. This response mattered because it drew a clear line between the original, unedited joke the show had actually aired weeks earlier and the new, doctored version that had been deliberately created and spread only after the real bombing took place. MacFarlane was not defending the doctored clip. He was specifically distancing himself and the show from a version of the joke that had never actually aired in that form at all. Fox, the network airing the show, took its own separate action once the situation began attracting widespread attention. The network pulled the original Turban Cowboy episode from both its own website, Fox.com, and from Hulu, the streaming service where past episodes were normally available for viewers to watch on demand. This decision meant that even the real, unedited episode, the one that had actually aired back in March without incident, was no longer easily available for people to stream once the surrounding controversy grew. Fox also confirmed at the time that it had no immediate plans to broadcast that specific episode again going forward, though later reporting notes that the episode did eventually return to normal rotation on the air by 2014, roughly a year after the controversy first erupted. It is worth being precise about exactly what happened in this specific case because it differs in an important way from most of the other controversies covered earlier in this story. This was not a case of the show intentionally making a joke about a real tragedy that had already happened, the way the Terri Schiavo storyline had directly referenced a real woman's real death from years earlier. The Boston Marathon joke was written and aired before the actual bombing took place, meaning nobody involved in writing or airing the original episode could have known that a similar real event would happen roughly a month later. The controversy did not come from the show mocking a tragedy that already existed. It came from an unfortunate and painful coincidence, an old joke about a fictional disaster suddenly resembling a real one that happened afterward, followed by someone deliberately editing that old joke to make the resemblance look far closer and far more deliberate than it had ever actually been. This distinction matters for understanding how the show and the network each responded. MacFarlane's public statement focused specifically on condemning the doctored clip, not on apologizing for the original joke itself, because the original joke had not actually predicted or referenced the real bombing in any way. Fox's decision to pull the episode from its website and Hulu, though, suggests the network was less concerned with debating the fine details of what the original joke had or had not shown, and more concerned simply with avoiding any further connection, however unfair or coincidental, between their show and a real and painful national tragedy that was still fresh in the news at the time. Coverage looking back at this event later made a clear point of explaining exactly how the hoax version differed from the real episode. One detailed piece walked through this directly, explaining that the actual cutaway gag showed Peter winning the marathon by mowing down runners with his car, presented as a scene entirely disconnected from the episode's main storyline, exactly the same disconnected style the show had used for its cutaway gags since its earliest seasons. That same piece noted that later, in the real episode, separate from the marathon scene entirely, Peter accidentally sets off an explosion using his cell phone, which destroys a completely different, fictional structure called the Quahog Bridge, a landmark that exists only within the show's own fictional town. The doctored viral clip took these two separate and unconnected scenes, the marathon joke and the unrelated bridge explosion joke, and edited them together into one single continuous sequence that never actually existed in that combined form in the real broadcast. Coverage explaining this breakdown noted specifically specifically that the marathon clip on its own, watched honestly and without the added editing, showed no actual explosions at all, despite how uncomfortable it remained to watch, in light of the real attack that had happened just weeks later.
This entire episode of Confusion connects to a much broader pattern that tends to follow major tragedies in the modern media environment, one where various conspiracy theories and false claims spread quickly online in the aftermath of serious events. Coverage discussing the Boston Marathon hoax specifically placed it inside this larger pattern, noting that a host of conspiracy theories had already appeared online following the bombing, describing this as similar to what had already happened after other major tragic events in recent memory, including the mass shooting at Sandy Hook Elementary School that had occurred just months earlier. The general pattern described across these theories involved people claiming that certain attacks either did not happen the way officially reported, or, in this specific case, had somehow been predicted in advance, all while ignoring the substantial evidence that clearly explained what had actually happened. Seth MacFarlane addressed this broader pattern directly in later comments, speaking more generally about how people had started treating Family Guy and other similar shows almost like some kind of psychic prediction machine, capable of somehow foreseeing real-world events before they occurred. He rejected this idea firmly, describing it as a strange thing to observe rather than something with any real basis. He explained that the writers on his show worked the exact same way as writers on other similar animated comedies, specifically naming The Simpsons and South Park as shows that operated using the same basic approach, making topical jokes based on whatever current events, rumors, or political material happened to be available to them at the time they were writing. MacFarlane argued that what people were actually witnessing was simply a strange feature of modern media itself, where being first to make a connection between events had somehow become more valued than being accurate about that connection, rather than any show actually possessing some kind of unusual ability to predict the future. This particular controversy stands apart from almost everything else covered in this story, because it did not really involve a debate about whether a joke was funny, offensive, or appropriate in the first place. Nobody seriously argued that the original marathon joke, on its own, had directly caused or somehow predicted the real bombing. The actual controversy was entirely about the aftermath, about a piece of media being deliberately altered and misrepresented after a real tragedy, about a network having to decide how to handle an old joke that had accidentally become associated with genuine pain and loss, through nothing more than unfortunate timing and someone else's deliberate editing. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Just over a year after this controversy played out, the show found itself at the center of public criticism once again, though this time, the trouble came from a completely different source. Rather than colliding with a real-world tragedy by accident, the show's own writers deliberately wrote a specific joke into a major crossover event, one that immediately drew formal criticism from the same watchdog organization that had already been filing complaints against the show for well over a decade. Section 9. Crossing over, crossing lines. The Boston Marathon controversy grew out of an accident, an old joke lining up painfully with a real tragedy that happened weeks later. Just over a year afterward, in September of 2014, Family Guy landed in a new controversy that had nothing accidental about it at all. This time, the show deliberately wrote a specific joke into one of the biggest events in its entire history, a full crossover episode with The Simpsons, and that joke drew formal criticism almost immediately, aimed directly at the show's own creative choices rather than at some unlucky coincidence. The episode is called The Simpsons Guy, and it brought together two of the longest-running animated shows on American television inside a single story, mixing the Griffin family with the Simpson family in one connected plot. A crossover this size was a major event on its own, something fans of both shows had wondered about and discussed for years before it actually happened. The size and visibility of this event meant that anything controversial inside it was guaranteed to draw far more attention than a typical Family Guy episode airing on a normal week, simply because so many more people, including many casual Simpsons fans who might not normally watch Family Guy at all, were paying close attention. Inside the episode, there is a scene built around prank phone calls, a running joke style that The Simpsons had used for decades, going back to one of that show's own most famous recurring bits, where Bart Simpson calls Moe's Tavern and tricks the bartender Moe into announcing an embarrassing-sounding name over the phone. In The Simpsons Guy, the same style of joke gets revisited, and Bart makes his usual kind of prank call to Moe. Right after that, Stewie, the baby from Family Guy, makes his own prank call to Moe as well, following the same basic setup as Bart's classic gag. Inside Stewie's call, though, he tells Moe that his own sister is being raped. This specific joke generated controversy before the episode even aired, because the line appeared in the trailer released ahead of the episode's broadcast, meaning people saw and reacted to the joke publicly before the full episode had even reached television screens. This detail matters because it
shows the backlash did not build up slowly after fans watched the whole episode and had time to consider it in context. It started almost immediately, based on a short promotional clip, showing how quickly a single line could generate concern once it reached a wide audience through advertising. Tim Winter, president of the Parents Television Council, the same watchdog organization covered extensively earlier in this story, responded to the joke by taking an unusual step. Rather than simply filing another one of the organization's many complaints against Family Guy specifically, the way the council had already done more than a dozen times across the previous decade, Winter wrote directly to Matt Groening, the creator of The Simpsons, in addition to writing to Seth MacFarlane and to Fox. This detail is worth noting carefully. The council had spent years treating Family Guy as its primary and most consistent target, but this particular joke appeared inside a crossover episode, meaning both shows and both creative teams shared some level of responsibility for what ended up airing. Winter's decision to include Groening directly in his complaint reflects that shared responsibility, extending the council's usual criticism beyond Family Guy alone for the first time in a case tied this directly to another major show. Winter's specific argument focused on a concern that went beyond simply saying the joke was in poor taste. He argued that jokes built around rape make the act, in his words, less outrageous in real life, suggesting that repeated exposure to rape used as comedy could gradually numb people to how serious the crime actually is. He also raised a more specific concern connected directly to this particular crossover, pointing out that children who watched The Simpsons regularly, but who did not normally watch Family Guy, would likely be completely unfamiliar with Family Guy's usual style of dark, boundary-pushing humor. Winter's argument suggested that these young viewers, drawn in by their existing familiarity with The Simpsons, could end up exposed to a joke about rape without any of the context or expectation that a regular Family Guy viewer would already bring into the episode. A spokesperson for Fox responded to the controversy by declining to comment on the specific joke, choosing not to defend or explain the line publicly through an official network statement. Seth MacFarlane did address the joke directly, speaking to Entertainment Weekly about the reaction. He acknowledged up front that he expected to face criticism for what he was about to say, and then stated plainly that he believed the joke was, in his own words, pretty funny in context. This response followed a pattern that had already shown up multiple times earlier in this story, MacFarlane defending controversial content directly rather than distancing himself from it or offering an apology, similar to how he had responded to the Palin controversy years earlier by defending the show's overall approach to satire rather than expressing regret over that specific joke. A spokeswoman from the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network, an organization built specifically around supporting survivors of sexual assault and raising awareness about these issues, offered a notably different reading of the joke than the Parents Television Council had. Rather than condemning the joke outright the way Winter had, she suggested that the show was actually making clear that rape is not funny, specifically through how the writers had chosen to position the joke within the scene. This response is worth paying close attention to, because it means the two organizations most directly connected to this specific controversy, one focused broadly on decency standards across all television, and one focused specifically and exclusively on supporting survivors of sexual violence, did not agree with each other on how to interpret the exact same joke. One organization saw it as dangerous and normalizing. The other, working specifically within the field the joke touched on most directly, offered a more measured and less condemning take on how the joke had actually been constructed and delivered. This split reaction mirrors something already seen earlier in this story, back during the Palin controversy, where Sarah Palin and her daughter reacted with anger, while Andrea Faye Friedman, the actress most directly connected to the actual subject matter of that joke, offered a completely different and far less critical perspective. In both cases, the loudest and most immediate public reaction did not necessarily match how people with the most direct connection to the sensitive subject matter actually interpreted the joke once they considered it closely. This pattern suggests that Family Guy's controversies rarely broke down into simple, one-sided arguments where everyone connected to the affected group agreed on how offensive or acceptable a specific joke really was. There is one more detail connected to this same crossover episode, unrelated to the rape joke itself, that shows how the show's reach for controversy continued well beyond just this one incident. This same episode season, Family Guy's 21st season overall, ended with a finale that drew a completely separate and unrelated complaint, this time coming from outside the United States entirely. A regional deputy from the Russian city of Chelyabinsk, a woman named Yana Lantratova, publicly criticized that particular season finale for how it portrayed her city. According to her criticism, the episode depicted Chelyabinsk in a deeply negative light, showing it as contaminated by radiation and portraying its citizens as drunkards and drug users who were generally dissatisfied with their own lives. This detail matters for understanding the full scope of what what kind of criticism Family Guy generated by this later point in its run. The show was no longer only drawing complaints from American watchdog groups, American advocacy organizations, and American families connected to specific jokes. It had reached a point where a real government official representing a real city in another country was publicly objecting to how her own community had been depicted on an American cartoon, showing that the show's reach for controversial material by this stage extended well past its original American audience and touched real places and real communities located entirely outside the country where the show was actually produced and broadcast. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Taken as a whole, the reaction to The Simpsons Guy shows a show that, by 2014, had built up such a long and well-documented history of controversy that a formal watchdog complaint over a single joke barely stood out as unusual anymore, even when that complaint reached all the way to the creator of a completely separate and hugely respected show. What did stand out, and what set the stage for what came next in the show's history, was the fact that criticism connected to the show's most sensitive subject matter, jokes touching on sexual violence specifically, was becoming louder and more frequent, arriving at almost the exact same period in the show's history when a completely different category of joke, one the show had leaned on constantly since its earliest seasons, was quietly heading toward its own permanent and very public turning point. Section 10, The Reversal, Phasing Out Gay Jokes. January of 2019 produced something that had never really happened before across this show's entire run, a public and deliberate announcement from the people running Family Guy that they were stepping back from one specific category of humor they had leaned on for 2 full decades. Multiple entertainment outlets reported that Family Guy would stop writing jokes built around gay stereotypes going forward. This announcement did not come from a leaked internal memo, and it did not come from an outside group forcing the show's hand through complaints, boycotts, or legal pressure, the way many of the other moments covered earlier in this story had unfolded. It came directly from the people running the show, confirmed publicly by 2 of its executive producers, Alex Sulkin and Rich Appel, along with creator Seth MacFarlane himself. The announcement arrived alongside a specific episode, one that handled the subject using the same self-aware, joke-filled style the show had always used, even while addressing something as serious as its own history of humor. The episode is called Trump Guy, and it premiered on January 13th, 2019. Inside that episode, Peter Griffin is shown talking to a cartoon version of President Donald Trump. During their conversation, Peter tells Trump directly that the show has been trying to phase out gay jokes. This meant the show chose to announce a real change in its own creative direction through a joke inside the show itself, rather than through a separate, formal statement standing completely apart from the program. The executive producers explained their reasoning in interviews that followed the episode's release. According to their comments, the decision reflected a wish to better match the current climate, acknowledging plainly that attitudes toward this specific kind of humor had shifted noticeably since the show first started making these jokes back in 1999. Jokes that had passed largely without serious pushback in the show's earliest seasons had, over the 20 years since, become the kind of material widely seen as outdated or hurtful, and the people running the show stated openly that they recognized this shift and intended to adjust their writing because of it. This announcement generated its own wave of coverage across major outlets, treated as a real news story rather than a minor footnote buried inside entertainment gossip. The Hollywood Reporter covered the story directly, laying out exactly what the producers had confirmed and why. CNN picked up the story as well, framing its coverage around the show's decision to move away from this specific style of humor going forward. The BBC covered it too, posing the question directly in its own headline, asking whether Family Guy should be phasing out these jokes at all, treating the show's internal decision as something worth a broader public discussion rather than settling the matter on its own. A separate outlet, news.com.au, covered the same announcement for an international audience, showing that this particular shift in direction reached well beyond American entertainment coverage alone. This moment stands apart from nearly everything else covered throughout this story, specifically because of who initiated the change. The AIDS deathbed joke drew backlash from advocacy groups years after it originally aired, but the show did not adjust its overall approach because of that specific criticism. The Palin joke drew a personal and public fight with a real family, but MacFarlane defended the joke as satire rather than treating it as something that needed correcting. The Boston Marathon episode was pulled temporarily by Fox only after a real tragedy created an unfortunate and painful coincidence with an old joke, not because the network had reconsidered the joke's content on its own. In each of those cases, outside pressure, tragedy, or public backlash came first, and any response from the show followed only after that pressure had already built up. The 2019 announcement flipped that order. The show's own producers spoke first,
first, publicly, and frame the change as something they had decided on their own terms, based on their own read of how audiences and culture had shifted over the 2 decades since the show began. It is important to look closely at how this decision actually played out in the show's writing afterward, because the full picture turned out to be more complicated than a single clean announcement might suggest. Later that same year, in the 18th season episode Disney's The Reboot, which premiered on October 20th, 2019, the show directly revisited its own earlier statement. In the episode, a character asks Peter Griffin a very direct question, pointing out that he had read reports claiming the show was phasing out gay jokes, and asking whether that was actually true. Peter's response undercuts the earlier announcement almost entirely. He replies that the quote had been taken out of context and widely misunderstood. This follow-up moment matters a great deal for understanding what this section of the show's history actually represents. The original January 2019 announcement was reported by several major outlets as a fairly clear and direct statement of intent, backed by on-the-record comments from named executive producers explaining their specific reasoning. Just 9 months later, the show itself wrote a scene appearing to walk that statement back, treating the entire idea as something that had been blown out of proportion or misread by the media, rather than treating it as an accurate description of an actual editorial decision the writers had made. 2 very different signals came from the same creative team within less than a year of each other, one suggesting a genuine and considered change in direction, the other suggesting, through in-show dialogue, that the original framing had been overstated. This kind of contradiction fits a pattern that runs through much of this story. Family Guy has rarely given clean, simple answers about its own intentions. Seth MacFarlane has spent years describing the show as an equal opportunity offender, a phrase used specifically during the Palin controversy years earlier, suggesting a guiding philosophy built around treating every group the same rather than singling any one group out. That same philosophy sits somewhat uneasily next to a specific named announcement about deliberately reducing one particular category of jokes aimed at one particular group, since reducing jokes about one group specifically is, by definition, a form of treating that group differently going forward compared to how it had been treated in earlier seasons. Whether that shift represents genuine growth, a response to changing audience expectations, or simply a temporary statement made to generate a specific news cycle before the show's usual approach continued largely unchanged, is a question this story cannot answer with full certainty. Because the show's own later dialogue in Disney's The Reboot directly complicates its own earlier public statement, what can be stated with full confidence is the sequence of events themselves, since each part of that sequence is well documented across multiple separate news outlets. Family Guy premiered in 1999 and immediately began drawing formal criticism for jokes touching on race, religion, and serious illness. The show spent its next 2 decades building one of the longest and most consistently documented controversy records in American television history, covering personal attacks on a sitting political figure's family, mockery of a woman who had already died after a 15-year medical and legal battle, an entire episode built around abortion that the network refused to broadcast domestically, a running pattern of violence against female characters extensive enough that one writer counted 14 consecutive episodes before finding one without it, an old joke that collided painfully with a real act of terrorism, and a formal complaint from a watchdog group reaching all the way to the creator of a separate legendary show over a joke about sexual violence. Then, in January of 2019, 20 years after the show first began facing this exact kind of criticism, its own executive producers stood up publicly and stated, on the record, that one specific and long-running category of that humor was being deliberately phased out, only for the show's own later dialogue that same year to describe that same announcement as misunderstood. That contradiction, a public promise to change, followed within months by an in-show line suggesting the promise had been overstated, is the last piece of evidence available in this entire 20-year record, and it leaves the story exactly where a story about this specific show probably always had to end. Not with a single clear verdict about whether the show got worse, better, or simply stayed exactly the same, but with one more example of a program that has spent over 2 decades saying 2 very different things about itself, often within the very same year. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.